um, theory, his account of what philosophy is. And so his book is doing what he says philosophy does, namely carrying out this genetic process, understanding the essence of a technical object, the essence of technicity, which goes beyond any one technical object through a genetic mode of thinking. Let's start with the conclusion. I can start reading. I'll read a couple paragraphs because these are short. To this day, the reality of the technical object has been relegated to the background behind the reality of human work. The technical object has been apprehended through human work, thought, and judged as an instrument, adjuvant, or product of work. However, one ought to be capable, in favor of man himself, to carry out a reversal that would enable what is human in the technical object to appear directly without passing through the relation of work. It is work that must be known as a phase of technicity, not technicity as a phase of work, for it is technicity that is the whole of which work forms a part, not the reverse. A naturalistic definition of work is insufficient. To say that work is the exploitation of nature by man in society is to reduce work to an elaborate reaction by man, taken as a species, in confrontation with nature, to which he adapts and which conditions him. What is at stake here is not a question of knowing whether this determinism in regard to the nature-man relation is one way or contains reciprocity. The hypothesis of reciprocity does not change the basic schema, which is to say the schema of conditioning and the reactional aspect of work, in which case it is work that gives the technical object its meaning, and not the technical object that gives its own meaning to work. So this, to me, sounds like he's setting out his own or demarcating his own project from a Marxist philosophy of technology or of techniques, I should say. So he is arguing that work is a secondary category, and I think we could also translate work, instead of work, we could say labor. I think it would be the same. It would be an acceptable translation of le travail. So he's arguing for the secondariness of work. Work is secondary to techniques rather than the other way around.
Judging by the first part, the first sentence in this second paragraph, one might sense that he's going to, at least momentarily, attempt to offer a new definition of work, but I think that won't be coming in the rest of the conclusion. What he's going to do, mainly, as you said, is like flip the order, not subordinate techniques to work, right?
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see as we go along to what extent he gives us a new understanding of work. But yeah, so he gives one possible definition, that's what he calls the naturalist definition of work, which would be to say that work is the exploitation of nature by human beings. And he thinks this is insufficient because it would reduce work to a sort of reaction of the human being to the natural world, and it doesn't account for the technical object specificity, I guess we could say, so that it's in work understood as part of a technical operation. There's a specific relationship between a human being and the natural world. It's not just a sort of general face-to-face relation of human and nature. It's a determinate schema of operation that he's set out in earlier parts of his work. So I think that's the objection here, is that it's too general, basically.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we can go on to the next paragraph then, if someone else would like to read.
From the perspective offered here, work can be taken as an aspect of the technical operation which is irreducible to work. There is work only when man must offer his organism as tool-bearer, that is, when man must, along with his organism and his psychosomatic unity, follow the step-by-step unfolding of the human-nature relation. Work is the activity through which man actualizes the mediation between the human species and nature within himself. In this case, we say that man operates as tool-bearer because he acts on nature in his activity and follows this action step by step, gesture by gesture. There is work when man cannot entrust the technical object with the function of mediation between the species and nature and must fulfill this function of relation himself through his body, his thought, his action. Man thus lends his own individuality as a living being in order to organize this operation. It is in doing this that he is a tool-bearer. On the other hand, when the technical object is concretized, the mixture of nature and man is constituted at the level of this object. Operation on the technical being is not exactly work. Indeed, in work, man coincides with a reality that is not human, submits to this reality, and to a certain extent, slides between natural reality and human intention. In work, man models matter according to a form. With this form, which is the intention of a result, comes a predetermination of what must be obtained at the end of the work, ouvrage, in accordance with the pre-existing needs. This form intention is not part of the matter onto which work applies itself. It expresses a utility or necessity for man, but it does not come from nature. The activity of work is what forms the link between natural matter and form, which comes from man. Work is an activity that succeeds in making two realities as heterogeneous as matter and form coincide and renders them synergetic. And the activity of work makes man aware of the two terms he synthetically relates, because the worker must have his eyes fixed on these two terms, which he must bring closer together. This is the norm of work, not on the interiority itself of the complex operation through which this bringing together is obtained. Work masks the relation in favor of the terms.
So he's bringing back this idea that he introduced, I believe, in the first part of the book, that the human being as a tool bearer is basically standing in the place of a technical individual. So insofar as a technical object becomes individuated, it is able to replace a human being in the sense that the machine, the individuated technical object, carries the tools that previously the human being had to carry. So treating work in the proper sense, or in the narrow sense that you want to use it here, work is an operation of a human being as a tool bearer. And so this is a narrow sense of work, because once the technical object becomes individuated, the human being no longer has to work in this proper sense. Whatever operations of supervision and maintenance and so on that human beings have to do on these machines that are now individuated is not work, properly speaking, because it's not the human being that is acting on matter, it's the machine that's doing that. And then we get into this hylomorphic schema, so the form-matter schema, which when we get to the individuation book, we'll see a long development of this idea in that book as well. But he argues that the form-matter schema it loses sight of the interaction between matter and form, the sort of middle term. It looks at the two external terms of matter and form, but it doesn't account for the way that the form is imposed onto the matter and the physical operation of informing matter. And so, in the same way, in this passage here, he argues that work is because work has this character of this hydomorphic character. The worker is aware of the goal to be achieved, the form to be imposed, and of the matter on which the form is going to be imposed. But the actual technical operation, the middle term between those two external terms, is sort of disappears from awareness, and it's sort of hidden in that operation. So work, for that reason, again, is not can't be taken as the fundamental term for him, or the fundamental operation. We have to understand work in relation to technicity rather than the other way around.
Orientation is not part of the matter.
Everyone's quiet today.
Hello. Sorry, I can't sit in my chair because of complicated body reasons, but I'm like lying on my back, so I have to sit up to push shift so I can talk. I was thinking that it was interesting the way he described the bringing the two terms together, right? And he kind of explicitly was, of course this is the English translation, which is so far not so great, but he seems to cash a lot of value out in terms of the seeing of the bringing together of the two terms involved in the work. So it's almost like there's this kind of like, I think the idea, the way that I would, I guess, throw something at it is to say that it's almost like a way to like make work kinetic again, to kind of like bring the conceptualization of work back to the mere kinetic aspect of the operational frame or the operational context, which I think that he wants to give a broader account of the operational context, which I guess that's what I'm calling his the context of the technical object, I suppose. In this sort of way, I think to do this, he's kind of making room for a specific kind of place for the kinetic function of work within the operational context of technicity.
Yeah, I think maybe instead of kinetic, we might want to use the word dynamic, a dynamic approach to work, just because dynamics has to do with forces, and that's precisely what he has in mind here, is the actual operations of forces, that the interaction between the worker, the tool that the worker is holding or operating, and the matter that they're operating on. So there's a dynamic operation that the worker is carrying out in this process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess dynamis and kinesis are both Greek terms that are used in these contexts. So that's probably where we can investigate that delineation if there was a significant distinction to be made. I think kinesis just seems to me to be more kind of subject oriented. That's why I kind of chose that term. Because it seems to me that when you have dynamics, you can just kind of be talking about like systemic forces in a kind of isolated contextually from any kind of like human action in some way, right? Whereas like work seems to be the idea with work seems to be more so it's not just that there's that third term, because you're saying there's like a third term between the two terms, but the third term is just kind of an abstraction we use to kind of describe our own mediating function, which is obscured by the terms which we're bringing together, right? Isn't that, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. I'm going to let other people talk now and lie back down.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's because in work, in work, it's the human being who brings the terms together, the two terms, matter and form. It's because it's the human being that brings them together that the middle term is or the mediation that the human being brings about is hidden in the process. Veiled, I think, is the word he uses. So it's the human being carries out the process, but also is unaware of the mediation that they're bringing about. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph.
I'll read. The serval condition of the worker has, moreover, often contributed to making the operation by which matter and form are made to coincide more obscure. The man who orders work to be done is concerned with what must appear in the given order, in terms of what content and of the raw material that is the condition of execution, rather than with the operation that enables the process of taking form to occur. The attention is given to form and matter, not to the process of taking form as operation. The hylomorphic schema is thus a couple in which the two terms are clear and the relation obscure. Under this particular aspect, the hylomorphic schema represents the transposition into philosophical thought of the technical operation reduced to work and taken as a universal paradigm of the genesis of beings. It is indeed a technical experience, but a very incomplete technical experience that is at the basis of this paradigm. The generalized use of the hylomorphic schema in philosophy introduces an obscurity that comes from the insufficiency of the schema's technical basis.
Here I wonder if these critiques of Aristotle really hit home or not, and I don't have the expertise to really know to say for sure, really, because it's very kind of dicey. I don't know if I think it's possible that Aristotle would accept some of the conclusions of the criticisms Simone was making in this section. So,
yeah, I guess we can distinguish maybe two different levels of the criticism that Simondon is making of the hylomorphic schema. So the first level would be that the relationship between the terms is obscure. We have within the hylomorphic schema, we have a clear representation of matter and form, but we have only an obscure representation of what the interaction between those two terms is. So that's a first level criticism. Then the second one is more of a social criticism, we can say, and it's that this schema of operation corresponds to something like a slave owner's position on the technical operation. So the master in a more general sense. So the master orders a certain job to be done. They order, this much raw material, and it should be put into this form. But then the actual operation itself is not part of the schema that they are operating with. So it's this hylomorphic schema is the result of this social organization in which some people are able to order work to be done, and then other people have to carry out those orders. So there's these two levels of the criticism. I think it's possible Aristotle might have accepted the first level of the criticism. Like he might have said there was a certain, or he might have agreed that there was a certain obscurity having to do with the relationship between the two terms in a hylomorphic schema. But the second one, I think, is something he definitely would not be able to accept, given his whole account of slavery as a natural condition and so on.
I don't know. Yeah, I'd be interested in looking into it. I'm less familiar with Aristotle's account of social orders, like slavery, the slavery related aspects, as I am with the kind of metaphysical arguments about the kind of incompleteness of certain types of dynamic aspects of both action and thinking. Whereas I'm not even sure where to look for Aristotle's account of slavery, but I have heard kind of like through the grapevine that he has some kind of problematic account of slavery. I wonder though, even if you had a kind of what I would imagine would be a kind of Aristotelian account of slavery, if that would be too incommensurate with what Simondon is making out an account like this in relation to. But I think to figure that out more, I think you would have to really kind of look at how he really look at the hylomorphic argument much more closely, I guess, and that I guess I don't know. It's very difficult for me to deduce anything very particular about the critique of Aristotle because of how horrible of an Aristotle scholar I am, and how I haven't done sufficient like reading on the matter already, and just kind of go on vague impressions and such. But I do think that there is a sense in which like the order work relation is something very central to the historical tradition post Aristotle. I just have to kind of see back, and I'm not sure what his account of the servile condition of the worker, because I mean, of course, there's a lot of people like to make a distinction within slavery talk between some kind of like pure slavery, some actual slavery, and then some kind of like general servitude where we have like a somewhat like legal sanctioned like indentured servitude, or for some kind of economic reason you have some kind of service. And even in general, kind of there's an overlap where work itself is kind of seen as service, or and it almost seems that there's a continuity all the way down between work and the conception of work and the conception of slavery. So in the declaration that like slavery is like natural in some way or part of the natural world, I don't think that would be enough to kind of exclude the Aristotelian perspective from being commensurate with this kind of account, I guess. I don't know. It's a really interesting and difficult question that I really have not thought about until just now or so.
Yeah, the reason I said that that I think the second level, this criticism at a social level is something that Aristotle would not be able to accept. Is that so in Aristotle's account of slavery, so he argues it's not just that slavery is like a natural condition, but that certain people are naturally slaves. That certain people are born into slavery. Their character, their personality, or whatever is suited for slavery, and this is a perfectly just arrangement. That certain people should be born into slavery is part of a just constitution of a social arrangement, but in particular, it's not the slave who has knowledge in the proper sense for Aristotle. It's the man of leisure, the slave owner, who is able to have theoretical knowledge, and in particular the highest kind of theoretical knowledge, theology, or first philosophy, science in general is the preserve of the slave owner, or the man of leisure, rather than of the slave. So I don't think Aristotle would be able to accept the idea that there is a certain type of knowledge, namely of the relationship between form and matter, that the slave has sort of preeminently, as opposed to the slave owner.
Perhaps, I think that it would kind of, I guess. Well, first I wanted to ask you where in Aristotle's writing is would you find argument? Is this in the politics, or is it in like what do you know which text would be the ones to look at for those arguments?
It's either in the politics or the Nicomachean Ethics. I can't remember. I think the politics, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I don't want to go too far down towards Aristotle, I guess, because that would be a secondary task, I suppose. Although a good amount of Simone seems to be this critique of hylomorphism, so it's probably a fairly important point.
For me, it isn't.
Yeah, this whole passage here on hylomorphism is a sort of a recapitulation of the more detailed discussion in the individuation book, which we should get to hopefully in the next few weeks, and we'll see a more detailed criticism of the hylomorphic schema and his alternative. Because it's a criticism. But it's not an outright rejection of the hylomorphic schema. He just argues that it's incomplete because it doesn't include the interaction between matter and form. So he wants to supplement it by taking that interaction, that middle term or the relation between the two as being fundamental and investigating that relationship, rather than starting from the terms and then leaving the relationship obscure. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph.
Indeed, it is not enough to enter the workshop with the worker or slave, or even to take the mold into one's own hands and to operate the potter's wheel. The point of view of the working man is still too external to the process of taking form, which is the only thing that is technical in itself. It would be necessary to be able to enter the mold with the clay, to be both mold and clay at once, to live and feel their common operation in order to be able to think the process of taking form in itself. For the worker, elaborates two technical half-chains that prepare the technical operation. He prepares the clay, makes it malleable, without lumps, without air bubbles, and correlatively prepares the mold. He materializes the form by making it into a wooden mold and makes matter pliable, capable of receiving information. Then he puts the clay into the mold and presses it, but it is the system constituted by the mold and the pressed clay that is the condition of the process of taking form. It is the clay that takes form according to the mold, not the worker who gives it its form. The working man prepares the mediation, but he doesn't fulfill a complete it. It is the mediation that fulfills itself on its own once the conditions have been created. Even though man is very close to this operation, he does not know it. His body pushes the mediation to fulfill itself, enables it to fulfill itself, but the representation of the technical operation does not appear in work. It is the essential part that is missing, the active center of the technical operation that remains veiled. For as long as man practiced work without using technical objects, technical knowledge could only be transmitted in an implicit and practical form, through professional habits and gestures. This motivating motor knowledge is effectively what enables the elaboration of two technical half-chains, the one starting from form and the one starting from matter. But it does not and cannot go further. It stops before the operation itself. It does not penetrate inside the mold. In its essence, it is pre-technical and not technical.
Mm.
So this is still drawing from the individuation book and specifying the criticism that hylomorphism doesn't deal with the interaction between matter and form. And so here he gives the specific case of the formation of bricks so you take clay and you put it in a mold, and then the physical interaction of the wooden mold and the clay forms the brick, puts the form into the matter, and gives the brick form. And so here the work, the actual operation of the worker is to prepare the two half chains, one leading from the form through the preparation of the clay and ensuring that it has the proper characteristics that it needs in order to take on form, and then the other half chain that starts from the form and puts it into a wooden mold, puts it into the shape of this wooden mold, and prepares the mold to receive the clay. These two half chains are what the worker does, but then the actual operation of taking form is something that comes about without the worker's participation or knowledge even. So the worker has this implicit knowledge or practical knowledge that of the professional habits and gestures, as he puts it. So this is like sort of guilds type knowledge of technical operations, but the actual form taking itself is something that is brought about without the worker's participation and knowledge.
I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why the working man is just the mediation, I guess.
So the actual mediation is what's brought about within the mold, but what the worker does is to prepare the two ends of the relationship to these half chains, as he describes it. So one chain that leads from the form and another chain that leads from the matter. But the actual link between those two chains is something that the worker does not bring about. So the real mediation is a natural process that is sort of set in motion by the worker, but the worker does not actually bring about themselves.
I guess I'm also struggling a little bit with understanding what it would mean to penetrate inside the mold. Is it a more scientific understanding of the kind of the conditions of the kind of clay and the mold? Is it I'm having difficulties with that, because it seems to me like the worker would be aware of that or something, that in preparing the clay, for instance, that they would have an understanding of its correct viscosity or something like that there would be all kinds of like signals to the worker to understand kind of what the best sort of output conditions will be once it goes through the mold or something.
Yeah, I think we'll see partly as we go into the next couple of paragraphs. So he'll give a better, a more detailed explanation of what he means, or what the contrasting type of knowledge would mean. The knowledge that he describes as, entering into the mold with the clay. But I think one way we can characterize it, given what we have so far, so he describes the knowledge of the worker as an implicit knowledge, and I think that would entail that the knowledge, the true technical knowledge that he's going to develop in the next paragraph, has to be an explicit knowledge of some kind. So the worker, yes, so they understand some of the properties that the clay has to have in order to take on a form in this process of work. But that knowledge is an implicit knowledge. They might know, the texture by feel of what the clay should feel like, but they don't have an explicit knowledge of, the clay has to have X percentage of moisture and whatever other properties, understood in explicit terms, what those properties are. So they can bring about the operation in a reliable manner. They have this implicit knowledge that's part of their capacity to carry out the operation, but they don't have the capacity to express explicitly what these properties are.
So he's looking. It's kind of like a higher order understanding of causality or something.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to get to is what he described earlier as the pure schemas of operation of technical objects, which is part of his general technology and the science that he wants to develop. So we're going to see. So it's I guess an abstract understanding of the dynamics of the technical operation, an understanding of what sorts of forces are interacting in the technical process, and it's stated in theoretical terms, in explicit terms that can be communicated to others, rather than an implicit knowledge that can only be learned through practice.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's the independence of the operational context is what that hinges on, and I think that he's trying to kind of give a kind of an account which excludes on one side the kind of bearing down of reflexivity in the broad sense, and then in the other sense the kind of instrumentality of work, which is really coming to fore in these paragraphs here as being kind of an insufficient condition to account for the individuated domain of technical objects, which I'm calling the operational context, I guess. But I'm not using the correct Simondonian terminology probably, but that's the way I'm kind of cashing out the philosophical argument here, is that, which is actually, it has a lot of really, really interesting implications, because almost in all cases, the operational context is reduced to instrumental factors of the working on the problem, the working on the technical problem or something like that, just kind of is what resolves it. Or the other sense, the kind of reflexive, kind of systematic solutions for the way that the networks of technical objects just kind of resolve themselves. So these are our kind of two implicit biases, I think, when it comes to consideration of technical objects, to kind of be hyper-reflexive or hyper-instrumental. And I think that what's going on with the delineation of work as only as an incomplete way of getting to the independence necessary for the domain of the technical objects, I think is, anyway, I forgot how I started the sentence, so I don't think I can finish it grammatically correctly, but I hope y'all follow me. I hope y'all can follow me. I do think that the incompleteness and the work concept is really, really being tied in together here, very most so, because especially when you have the human who is doing the work, the working, is not doing their fulfilling. So there's a separation between the action and the manifestation of the action, which is like exact and impermeable, sort of, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I think is most striking here. And this is the height of that point, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, is that the operation of work is distinct from the fulfillment of the form-taking operation. So the worker is able to put the form and matter in contact through these two semi-chains or half-chains, but the actual fulfillment of the form-taking is something that happens without the worker's participation. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph. Where are we? We're at technical knowledge, on the contrary.
Technical knowledge, on the contrary, consists in starting from what happens inside the mold in order to find the different elaborations that can prepare it by starting from the center. Man cannot leave the center of operation in the dark when he no longer intervenes as tool bearer. It is the center that must effectively be produced by the technical object, which does not think or feel, and which does not acquire habits. In order to construct the technical object that will function, man needs to represent to himself the way of functioning that coincides with technical operation which accomplishes it. The functioning of the technical object belongs to the same order of reality, the same system of causes and effects as the technical operation, there is no longer heterogeneity between the preparation of the technical operation and the functioning of this operation. This operation prolongs the technical functioning just as the functioning anticipates this operation. The functioning is an operation in the operation of functioning. One cannot speak of the work of a machine, but only of its functioning, which is an ordered ensemble of operations. Form and matter, if they still exist, are at the same level and belong to the same system. There's continuity between the technical and the natural.
Maybe you can also read just the next little short paragraph.
Sure. Making the technical object is no longer accompanied by this obscure zone between form and matter. Pre-technical knowledge is also pre-logical, in the sense that it constitutes a couple of terms without discovering the interiority of the relation, like in the hylomorphic schema. Technical knowledge, on the contrary, is logical, in the sense that it seeks the interiority of the relation. Interesting logical distinctions here in that second little paragraph.
Yeah, what's pre-technical knowledge?
So pre-technical knowledge is the knowledge that he was characterizing in the last paragraph as implicit knowledge. So the knowledge that the worker has of the technical operation without a knowledge of the interaction between matter and form itself, as opposed to the technical knowledge which he's characterizing in this paragraph as being a knowledge that starts from the center of the operation, the interaction itself, and sort of works outwards from there. Yeah, that last short paragraph is a little bit obscure, I think. So pre-technical knowledge is also pre-logical in the sense that it constitutes a couple of terms without discovering the interiority of the relation. So in what sense, why does that make it pre-logical? I'm not 100% sure about that.
I think here, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
It makes me think about the word habit here when we think about pre-logical and this implicit knowledge, like how come it's a kind, what, is there no logic to habits, I guess?
It's also pre-logical in the sense that it constitutes a couple of terms without discriminating.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Technical knowledge on the code.
No, I think I know what you're getting at. I think here logical is being used in a sort of a strong sense. So it's not just doesn't just mean coherent or consistent or something along those lines. But it means something like a scientific, a clear representation with like a scientific definition of terms, so that would be opposed to habitual knowledge. So even if habits might have a logic in a broader sense, they might have a certain coherence and consistency. In the specific sense that he's using the term logic here, they don't have this explicit definitions and scientific clearness to them.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think here, I oftentimes, when logic is used in a broad sense, I used to tell people about like paraconsistent or pluralistic metalogical kind of positions, and that didn't ever work very well. Speaking with Anglophone people, they're just like, logic means the thing goes with the other thing. So I say, oh, they must be talking about the European logic, because what I'm really talking about, and I don't want to go into too many details when I talk to them usually, is the Hegel's criticisms of Aristotelian logic and the science of logic and the kind of dialectical logic and transcendental logic tradition stemming from the critical project, etc., and the tradition of German idealism, which I think a lot of European authors will kind of write in as though for us, the reader, it's just extremely obvious, like all this, oh, of course, logic is this extremely huge project. When a lot of people in the English-speaking world think of logic as purely the kind of formal apparatus which Hegel criticized kind of semi-ironically for it being a kind of for it being too Aristotelian, too much following in the organon, the kind of syllogistic, mechanistic, syllogistic logical tradition, where you fill it in and it works out this exact way in the sense of classical logic. And so where Hegel criticized this classical conception of logic, not for its logical merits, but for the pragmatic use of the formal apparatus. I think Simondon is just almost in the same way kind of echoing this very kind of, at this point, 100-year-old, 150-year-old criticism of Aristotelian logic as being this kind of spiritless formalism. And so I think that when he's talking about logic, he's definitely trying to talk about it, and he wants to point to something not entirely obvious, point to something related to this interiority, this broad project of logic. So anything besides the mere mechanistic movement of syllogistic formulations. Anyway, that's my spiel on logic, I guess.
Yeah, I think he's definitely not, Simondon here is definitely not thinking about, when he talks about logic, he's not saying, like the syllogism or something purely formal on those lines. But I think logical thought here means something like a thinking that is carried out using strict scientific definitions, fully explicit definitions of terms, and clearly explicitly represented concepts, and so on. And I think maybe we can characterize, so the distinction between the pre-technical thought is pre-logical in the sense that it's not fully clarified. The relationship between the terms is left obscure, and then technical thought is logical in the sense that it expresses this relationship in explicit terms. I think that might be what he's getting at here.
I don't know. I doubt it in a sense that I think it's defining explicit terms, which I think he's trying to call non-logical.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Just it looks to me also like he means logic, as you said earlier, in a grand sense, maybe, since he has some exchange going here with Aristotle and the whole philosophical tradition. I feel he might mean a skipped premise kind of thing, since we are talking about the middle term here between form and matter, which is obscured. So maybe it is like, I think he wants things to be neat, so he's bringing logic into it alongside techniques. So he's casting his net wide in a sense. That's how it looks to me.
Very different from the one coming from the technical version.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that middle term, because I hadn't thought of that connection here, but in syllogistic, you need to have three terms in order for to produce a valid argument, and then one term has to be shared between the two premises. So that middle term, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Man is the middle term that is shared between the two premises. So I guess insofar as the pre-technical knowledge doesn't have a middle term, it doesn't have that operational center between the form and matter. It's not a valid syllogism. It's not a logical thinking in that sense. Whereas the technical knowledge, which does have a representation of the operational center of the form taking, it has the middle term represented, and so it does coincide with the form of the syllogism.
I think this is one of my favorite parts of philosophy is the context of the enthymetic, I guess, is the term people use to describe the syllogistic formalism with one incomplete, or that is incomplete, and because it's missing one element. This is just such a famous and I think like very, very under-referenced, under-mentioned kind of aspect of the philosophical tradition, is this notion of like the incompleteness of the syllogism and its implications for the logical operation, I guess.
Yeah, there's a whole, I guess, tradition, or sort of minor tradition of having to do with material inferences, so inferences that have to do with the properties of concepts, and rather than the form of the propositions. So something like, if A is east of B, then B is west of A. That's a perfectly valid inference, but it depends not on the form of the proposition, but on the content of the concepts east and west. And there's one, I guess, approach to this type of inference that would see these inferences as enthymemes, as missing a premise. So you have to add a premise that says like, everything that is east of, or for every A that is east of B, then B is west of A, or you'd have to add a universal premise along those lines, and then you could make the inference. But there's also, this may be going a little bit of a digression, but there's the famous piece by Lewis Carroll on Achilles and the tortoise, where he shows how you can always any modus ponens inference, so any inference of the form if A then B, A therefore B, you can always treat it as missing a premise, and you have to add another conditional in order to fill in the gaps, and then that next conditional is missing a premise, and you have to add another conditional to fill in the gap, et cetera, et cetera. So there's good reason to think that inference that there's a sort of more basic material inference, and then formal inference is a secondary process, which is sort of derived from it. That's sort of an excursus on logic. But it's an interesting issue within philosophy of logic.
I think that actually could be more relevant here than, I think it could be very, very relevant here, actually. Like if we take the entire like context of the difference between work and the operation, the more full operational context, the technical object. I think if we take that all in the logical sense, and then think of like the work of solving logical problems, for instance, and then we kind of think about the purely kind of formal resolution versus like the action of the work of the solving of it. So in our working, it's just an incomplete mediation where we're obscuring the middle term. But what is this middle term? It's not the middle term in the syllogism that we're working on necessarily, right? It's the middle term here is us as the worker on this project, and it's our the constitution of the domain of the technical object by our work, which we can't see as while we're working on it. It's almost a Heideggerian argument in that regards, right? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I just thought of that just now because there's a sense in which like Heidegger doesn't argue for this like sense where you're if you're fully involved in the work, was a tool being or something like that, then you lack a certain kind of technical knowledge. It's only when something goes wrong that that technical knowledge is seeked out, right? Isn't that the Heideggerian argument? I'm really bad at Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of roughly the position that Heidegger sets out in Being and Time. But yeah, so the idea is that the sort of basic, the more fundamental relationship to a hammer, say, is not to treat the hammer as an object of knowledge, but to simply use it to hammer a nail or whatever other technical operation. So that's the more fundamental relationship that human beings have to objects or sorry, not to objects, but to entities, I guess you could say, is to use them rather than to treat them as objects of knowledge. And I think, yeah, there is maybe something similar going on here in the sense that this, what Simondon describes as this pre-technical knowledge, is a knowledge in use only. It's not and he had earlier described it as implicit knowledge. So it's knowledge that can't be communicated in language or in an explicit form. That's the sort of more basic relationship of a human being to the natural world and to the object being worked upon. And the more developed form, the actual logical form of knowledge or technical knowledge is something that comes about only later.
This is somewhat unrelated, perhaps, but there's another point that I find striking here. There seems to be a suggestion that between technicity and work, perhaps one way of approaching the difference would be the way representation itself affects realization, in a sense. I'm thinking of here the Bergsonian distinction between possible and real, or it's the critique of that distinction. Maybe technical object does not translate something pre-existent into matter in the way work does for Simondon. I don't know. So this I base on the passage that starts with, in order to construct a technical object that will function, man needs to represent to himself the way of functioning that coincides with technical operation, which accomplishes it. So here, representation also seems to have a hand, at least, in the accomplishment of technical operation.
Yeah, I take representation here to be something like explicit knowledge. I think so. In order to construct a machine that will carry out a technical operation, you have to have an explicit knowledge of the operation of that machine and the way that it's the functioning of the machine coincides with the technical operation to be brought about. Yeah, so I think representation here means something like explicit knowledge, so knowledge that can be formulated and communicated to others. And it's interesting also to compare this with what he had described in the last the end of the chapter 3 that we read last time, when he talks about intuitive knowledge, philosophy as proceeding through intuition, I think in Bergsonian approach, intuition is sort of opposed to language and communication. Language has to do with the world of matter, of extended objects in space, whereas intuition has to do with the internal experience of the passing of time. And so they're sort of opposed to each other. But here, this intuitive knowledge of the coming into being of the process of taking on form and so on is something that he characterizes as an explicit knowledge, as something that can be communicated. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph. I can read. I'll read the next couple ones because they're short. It would be extremely important to observe that the paradigmatism arising from the relation of work is very different from the one coming from the technical operation, from technical knowledge. The hylomorphic schema belongs to the content of our culture. It has been transmitted since classical antiquity, and we often think of this schema as perfectly grounded, not relative to a particular experience, perhaps improperly generalized, but coextensive with universal reality. The process of taking form ought to be treated as a particular technical operation, rather than treating all of the technical operation as particular cases of the process of taking form, which is itself obscurely known through work. In this sense, the study of the mode of existence of technical objects should be extended by the study of the results of their functioning and of man's attitudes in the face of technical objects. A phenomenology of technical object would thus be extended into a psychology of the relation between man and the technical object. Yet two pitfalls should be avoided in this study, and it is precisely the essence of the technical operation that makes them avoidable. Technical activity belongs neither to the pure social domain nor to the pure psychic domain. Technical activity is the model of the collective relationship, which cannot be confused with one of the two preceding ones. It is not the only mode and the only content of the collective, but it is of the collective. And in certain cases, it is around technical activity that the collective group can arise. It's interesting here that he seems to characterize his own project and what he's done in this book as a phenomenology of the technical object. And then he's calling for a successor project or a sequel, which would be a psychology of the relationship between man and the technical object.
Yeah, what does the psychology of the relation mean when he is talking about the psychology? In what sense does he mean it?
Yeah, that's a bit of a subtle point, it looks like, because he immediately goes on to say that the technical operation or technical activity belongs neither to the pure social domain nor the pure psychic domain. So psychology would, in some sort of traditional sense, would be something that would deal with the psychic domain. But Simondon here is saying that technical activity doesn't belong purely to the psychic domain. So it's this is a sort of psychosociology or a socio-psychology or something like that. It's some sort of science of the interaction between individuals and groups, it looks like.
It also sounds like he's trying to avoid hylomorphism in the social sciences just as much as he is around our understanding of technical objects, right? That both psychology and sociology would suffer from having a sense of the individual as they, as one in a population or one mind. These things are already sort of hylomorphic in the ways that they're framed.
Yeah, I think he might be sort of pointing towards his notion of the trans-individual, which has to do with the process of individuation beyond the bounds of one individual. The formation of a psychic individual is a process that leaves behind something pre-individual, and so the different individuals that make up a group, they each have something of the pre-individual left within them, and so they can undergo a collective individuation process through that remnant of the pre-individual left within them, and that's what he characterizes as the trans-individual. And so I think that might be what he's pointing towards here. The idea of not something that is neither purely individual, the purely psychic, nor a purely group phenomenon, the purely social, but it's the process through which a group is formed through what is left behind of the pre-individual within individuals. I'm not sure here what exactly it means to say that, or what he means by saying that technical activity is the model of the collective relationship, which cannot be confused with one of the two preceding ones. The preceding ones being the social domain and the psychic domain, I assume. Yeah, why is technical activity the model of the collective relationship?
Doesn't it mean that the technical ensemble in which you find yourself will be the basis upon which you will be social with other people, right? Whether it's a town that's organized around a water wheel, or whether it's a factory floor that's organized around some automated processes or something, that these are the conditions under what the kind of material conditions under which you'll have a collective relation to other people.
It could be. My hesitation here is the word model. It sounds like what you're describing doesn't really sound like a modeling relationship. Like that would be something more like I don't know, relationship of determination or something like that. Okay. The technical ensemble would determine the form of the social relationship or something along those lines. But he suggests, or the term model to me suggests that there's some sort of a copying relationship between the two. So in some way, the
model of the
collective relationship is supposed to be copied from the technical activity, but I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to mean.
I think of it this way. I think in its context, in his readership, there would be a lot of people who would accept a version of this statement as true, almost given. So this sentence would not read for them something like technical activity is the model of the collective relationship, but work is the model of the collective relationship. So I think I'm talking about his relationship to Marxism again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that would make sense given his, his what he stated at the beginning of this conclusion, that the technical is the more fundamental. We have to understand work in relation to the technical rather than the other way around. So yeah, I guess if work, if we treat work, or if he's sort of starting from a conception that treats work as the fundamental collective relationship, and then he's relativizing that by setting work within the context of the technical. Maybe that's sort of what he's has in mind when he makes that statement here. I'm not sure.
This conversation is putting me in mind of a few other people. I guess like the Muriel Combs book does this a little bit, and there's another one. I think maybe Alberto Toscano talks about the way that Simondon kind of vulgarizes Marxism a little bit. That he kind of that they both sort of describe kind of missed opportunities, which are starting to sound somewhat like this kind of tension that we're working through here a little bit. That he was oversimplifying Marxism and maybe oversubstantializing the conceptualization of work in order to read his notion of technical activity more carefully alongside it and say that this is a superior way of looking at technical objects than Marxism ever came up with.
Interesting.
Yeah, his engagement with Marxism doesn't seem to be especially deep. I mean, it's always difficult to tell because he never cites his sources, but there's no sort of like there are points where we can say that he's probably thinking of Marxism here as something to set himself against, and there are a few instances where he does actually mention Marxism explicitly, but it's generally sort of in passing and not really like a developed argument or engagements. So yeah, it would be interesting to see some of these ideas developed with a more thorough engagement with Marxism to try to understand have a better understanding of where the delineation lies between the two.
My first readings in philosophy of technology were Jacques Ellul, who claims to be much more informed by the Marxist tradition, although he's characterized differently by different people. He's in a weird idiosyncratic spot, I guess. But it would be interesting, I guess, to kind of compare and contrast, like like the way that work is posed. Usually, I think Ellul he's much less systematic in many regards than Simondon here, especially with like the stuff on essence of technicity. Like there's nothing even really seemingly correspondent to that in his universe of the technical society. So I think that in some sense there's a certain negative ontology, or at least a kind of minimal kind of definition set of work in the Marxist tradition, so that it will always fit within the systematic parameters of the economic theory. So I think that usually the accounts that I see of Marxist accounts of work tend to be minimal in regards to just for that capacity, so that there's further coherence with the systematic goals of Marxist philosophy. So, just to expand on this, just very slightly and conclude, I guess. I mean, I think that Simondon here gives kind of an essentialist account of work that fits in with a very strongly essentialist kind of position on technology and techniques, whereas this is kind of in counterpoint to what I would see as like the tradition following from Marxism, which would tend to want to kind of put in contrast work to the kind of greater systematic goals, for instance. And so there's a kind of distance sort of in the Marxist tradition of talking about work, which is anti-essentialist usually, or at least it turns out to be anti-essentialist in many ways. I don't know. This is just my vague apprehension. I'm not really a big I don't follow a lot of Marx type stuff. The most of the Marx that I'm interested in is like Sartre's existential Marxism and stuff like that. But and what is his name? Lefebvre. I can never say it. Lefebvre. I think that's how you say it. It's another French guy whose name I can't pronounce. But anyhow, yeah, I think this broadly hinges on essentialist versus anti-essentialist lines, at least as far as the contrast between Simondon and Marx would go, or Marxist theory would go in the proclivities. That's my intuition.
Yeah, there is some tradition within the. There is a sort of a sub-tradition within the Marxist tradition of labor process theory, and it starts from Marx himself, of course, in Capital. There's a chapter on the labor process, and then there are people like Harry Braverman and David Noble, I guess, who maybe we put in that tradition as well. But look at a close analysis of the labor process and understanding the way that the operation is carried out. So there is, I guess, a point where you could have a sort of productive engagement between what Simondon is trying to do, and a Marxist tradition as well. But I'm not sure if anyone's really developed that sort of connection between the two.
What did you call it? Labor relations theory?
Labor process theory.
Theory. Okay. I'll have to keep that in my memory. I've always found it very difficult to find in just general philosophical works really robust accounts of work or labor, and I'm always I always take note when I see something along those lines.
But yeah, I think we can go on to the next paragraph. We are at where are we? What we mean here by social group. That's where we are.
What we mean here by social group is one that constitutes itself, like for animals, according to an adaptation to the conditions of the milieu. Work is that through which the human being is mediator between nature and humanity as a species. On the opposite end, but at the same level, the interpsychological relation puts individual before individual, establishing a reciprocity without mediation. Through technical activity, on the contrary, man creates mediations, and these mediations are detachable from the individual who produces and thinks them. The individual expresses himself in them, but does not adhere to them. The machine has a sort of impersonality which allows it to become an instrument for another man. The human reality that it crystallizes within itself is alienable precisely because it is detachable. Work adheres to the worker, and reciprocally, through the intermediary of work, the worker adheres to the nature on which he operates. The technical object, which is thought and constructed by man, is not limited to simply creating a mediation between man and nature. It is a stable mixture of the human and the natural. It contains human and natural aspects. It gives its human content a structure comparable to that of natural objects, and allows for the integration of this human reality into the world of natural causes and effects. The relation of man to nature, rather than being only lived and practiced obscurely, takes on a status of stability, of consistency, making it a reality that has laws and an ordered permanence. In edifying the world of technical objects and by generalizing the objective mediation between man and nature, technical activity reattaches man to nature through a far richer and better defined link than that of the specific reaction of collective work. A convertibility of the human into the natural and of the natural into the human establishes itself through the technical schematism.
Edifying the world of technology. I don't know.
So I guess what he's doing here is specifying in what sense this technical activity has to be distinguished from the pure social domain and the pure psychic domain. So work as a collective enterprise of human beings would be something in the collective domain, and then there's the interpsychological, the relationship of one individual to another, which doesn't grasp the technical activity either. And then technical activity is something in which there's mediation between the human being and the world and the natural world, but it's not attached to the individual in the same way that work is. So there's an impersonality of technical knowledge and technical activity that allows it to be separated from an individual, and so it becomes a part of the collective heritage or something along those lines. All right, it doesn't seem to be much to say about this paragraph, so we can go on to the next one if someone else would like to read.
I'll read. By thus constructing a structured world, the technical operation, rather than being pure empiricism, leads to the emergence of a new relative situation of man and nature. Perception corresponds to the direct challenge that the natural world puts to living man. Science corresponds to the same challenge through the technical universe. For work without obstacles, sensation is enough. Perception corresponds to the problem that emerges at the level of work. On the other hand, as long as techniques succeed, on the contrary, scientific thought is not called upon to emerge. When techniques fail, science is near. Science corresponds to a problematic formulated at the level of techniques, but unable to find a solution at the technical level. Techniques intervenes between perception and science in order to provoke a change of level. It provides the schemas, the representations, and the means of control of mediations between man and nature. Having become detachable, the technical object can be grouped with other technical objects according to such or such setup montage. The technical world offers an indefinite availability of groupings and connections. For what takes place is a liberation of the human reality that is crystallized in the technical object. To construct the technical object is to prepare an availability. The industrial grouping is not the only one that can be brought about with the technical objects. Non-productive groupings can also be brought about, whose end is to relate man and nature through an ordered succession of organized mediations to create a coupling between human thought and nature. Here, the technical world intervenes as a system of convertibility.
So this is the last paragraph we had, the human natural convertibility brought about by the technical schematism. And in this paragraph, we have a system of convertibility of a different one, I think, between one technical object and another, a grouping of the technical objects with other technical objects. So there's a convertibility, human nature convertibility in the last paragraph, and then in this paragraph, a object-to-object convertibility, I guess.
I'm not sure if the second paragraph, the one we just read, I'm not sure if the convertibility here is supposed to be between objects. I think we might still be talking about convertibility between humanity and nature, or the human and natural. Because just in the line right before it, before that last sentence, where does it say? Sorry, just a second. Non-productive groupings can also be brought about whose end is to relate man and nature through an ordered succession, enchaînement réglé, of organized mediations to create a coupling between human thought and nature. Here, the technical world intervenes as a system of convertibility. So it seems to me that the convertibility in question here is still the convertibility between human and natural, but it's a different type of convertibility, because here it's not a productive convertibility. It's not human beings operating on the natural world, but it's the scientific convertibility is using technical groupings of objects, groupings of technical objects to bring about a knowledge of nature, or a couplage between human thought and nature.
Yeah. Minimally, I guess the second would just be couched in the former, or the latter would be couched in the former. The interchangeability of the setup, the montage, and that kind of convertibility seems to be what is part of the structure of the convertibility of nature, the human into the natural. So it seems to be that one is just part of the other, I guess. So yeah, it does seem that that's correct. Also, that to construct a technical object is to prepare an availability was an interesting idea.
What takes place with liberation from knowledge?
Like the preparing an availability. It kind of reminded me of kind of business lingo when people talk about like turnkey solutions. It's like they want a method that is tied to kind of directly into an expectation of some manifest results. Kind of a fully a fully ready, capable thing, right? So the capacity is just ready to go, ready to fire. They're available for use, right?
But it can also be read in a more emancipatory way, if I may. I think the word liberation there is not to be taken very lightly, it seems. But he says what takes place, the liberation of the human reality that is crystallized in technical object.
Liberation
Maybe
of human reality.
the human reality was not liberated, so it was enchained in a certain sense. So technical object is helping in its own way to bring about this liberation through this availability.
Yeah, I do think that word liberation is meant in a strong sense. It's not just used sort of carelessly or anything like that here. So yeah, there's in some sense being able to produce these groupings of technical objects, the fact that these technical objects are detachable and groupable in various ways is a liberation of the human reality that is crystallized in these technical objects. So I guess it's insofar as these technical objects are not tied to one particular person or one particular arrangement of other technical objects, that means that the schemas of operation within that technical object are liberated from those ties to individual people or individual technical setups.
So it's we're saying that it's emancipatory in the sense of allowing for a greater diversity of relations or greater diversity of connections in terms of building out larger technical systems?
I don't think it's just larger. I don't think that's just a sort of a straightforward equation of a larger technical system with liberation. But I think it's here. So it's in the sort of particular case that he points to in the next couple sentences. It's the capacity of using technical objects for scientific ends rather than productive ends.
Right.
So I think that's one instance, at least, if not sort of the paradigm case of using, of liberating the human reality in a technical object is using it for scientific ends.
Right. Which is kind of more like a deeper understanding or more profound understanding or something like that, and not just a question of scale of productivity or something.
Yeah, it helps to bring about this coupling between human thought and nature. So, it develops a deeper relationship between the human being and the natural world by using these technical objects for scientific ends.
The way I see it, he may be suggesting there is something limiting in the way work generally is anchored to here and now, by definition.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think as he understands it, the work relationship is always tied to the worker and the object worked upon, whereas the technical activity is detachable from any individual person and from any particular object worked upon. It can be rearranged and reorganized in various ways, including for non-productive purposes like science. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph, which will probably be our last one as we're approaching the end here. If someone else would like to read.
The work paradigm is what pushes us to the consideration of the technical object as a utilitarian one. The technical object does not carry its utilitarian aspect within itself as an essential definition. It is that which performs a determinate operation, which fulfills a certain function according to a determinate schema. But precisely because of its detachable aspect, the technical object can be employed in an absolute manner as a link in a chain of causes and effects, without this object being affected by what happens at either end. The technical object can perform the analog of a work task, but it can also transport information beyond any utility for determinate production. It is the function and not the work that characterizes the technical object. Thus, there are not two categories of technical objects, those serving utilitarian tasks and those serving knowledge. Any technical object can be scientific and vice versa. To the contrary, one would call scientific a simplified object that would only be suitable for teaching. It would be less perfect than the technical object. The hierarchical distinction of the manual and the intellectual does not affect the world of technical objects.
Yeah, so this paragraph seems to be basically just a summary of what we've read the last couple paragraphs. Basically just the reason or a sort of summary of why the treating work as the paradigm for or starting on the basis of work to understand technical reality is starting from the wrong end, and it's only through starting from technical reality that we can understand work instead.
Looks good. Hey, Ken.
Yeah, we're just finishing now, so it's good timing. Yeah, so I think we can finish here for today. We actually went a little bit slower than I expected, so we may not finish next time. We have about 8 pages left in the conclusion. But yeah, that's fine. We don't have any time limit, so we can take 3 weeks to finish the conclusion if we want, rather than 2.
Sounds good. I like open-ended.
Okay, so thank you everyone for showing up and for your contributions, and see you next week.